The Hunter, Chapter 3 of Shardik by Richard Adams, read by Celeste Lawrenson in September 2020. The Hunter. The island, some 25 miles long, divided the river into two channels, its upstream point breaking the central current, while that downstream lay close to the unburned shore which the bear had failed to reach. Tapering to this narrow eastern end, the strait flowed out through the remains of a causeway, a rippling shallow, dangerously interspersed with deep holes built by long-vanished people in days gone by. Belts of reeds surrounded most of the island, so that in wind or storm the waves, instead of breaking directly upon the stones, would diminish landwards, spending their force invisibly among the shaking reed beds. A little way inland from the upstream point, a rocky ridge rose clear of the jungle, running half the length of the island like a spine. At the foot of this ridge, among the green-flowering quain, the bear slept as though it would never wake. Below it and above, the reed beds and lower slopes were crowded with fugitive creatures that had come down upon the current. Some were dead, burned or drowned, but many, especially those accustomed to swim, otters, frogs, and snakes, had survived and were already recovering and beginning to search for food. The trees were full of birds which had flown across from the burning shore, and these, disturbed from their natural rhythms, kept up a continual movement and chatter in the dark. Despite fatigue and hunger, every creature that knew what it was to be preyed upon, to fear a hunting enemy, was on the alert. The surroundings were strange. None knew where to look for a place of safety, and as a cold surface gives off mist, so this lostness gave off everywhere a palpable tension. Sharp cries of fear, sounds of blundering movement and sudden flight, much unlike the normal, steady night rhythms of the forest. Only the bear slept on, unmoved as a rock in the sea, hearing nothing, scenting nothing, not feeling even the burns which had destroyed great patches of its pelt and shriveled the flesh beneath. With dawn, the light wind returned, and brought with it from across the river the smell of mile upon mile of ashes and smouldering jungle. The sun, rising behind the ridge, left in shadow the forest below the western slope. Here the fugitive animals remained, skulking and confused, afraid to venture into the brilliant light now glittering along the shores of the island. It was this sunshine, and the all-pervading smell of the charred trees, which covered the approach of the man. He came wading knee-deep through the shallows, ducking his head to remain concealed below the feathery plumes of the reeds. He was dressed in breeches of coarse cloth and a skin jerkin roughly stitched together down the sides and across the shoulders. His feet were laced round the ankles into bags of skin resembling ill-shaped boots. He wore a necklace of curved, pointed teeth, and from his belt hung a long knife and a quiver of arrows. His bow, bent and strung, was carried round his neck to keep the butt from trailing in the water. In one hand he was holding a stick on which 3 dead birds, a crane and 2 pheasants, were threaded by the legs. As he reached the shadowed western end of the island, he paused, raised his head cautiously, and peered over the reeds into the woods beyond. Then he began to make his way to shore, the reeds parting before him with a hissing sound like that of a scythe in long grass. A pair of duck flew up, but he ignored them, for he seldom or never risked the loss of an arrow by shooting at birds on the wing. Reaching dry ground, he at once crouched down in a tall clump of hemlock. Here he remained for 2 hours, motionless and watchful, while the sun rose higher and began to move round the shoulder of the hill. Twice he shot, and both arrows found their mark, the one a goose, the other a ketlana, or small forest deer. Each time he left the quarry lying where it fell and remained in his hiding place. Sensing the disturbance all around him, and himself smelling the ashes on the wind, he judged it best to keep still and wait for other lost and uprooted creatures to come wandering near. So he crouched and watched, vigilant as an Eskimo at a seal hole, moving only now and then to brush away the flies. When he saw the leopard, his first movements were no more than a quick biting of the lip and a tightening of his grasp on his bow. It was coming straight towards him through the trees, pacing slowly and looking from side to side. Plainly it was not only uneasy, but also hungry and alert, as dangerous a creature as any solitary hunter might pray to avoid. It came nearer, stopped, stared for some moments straight toward his hiding place, and then turned and padded across to where the Ketlana lay with the feathered arrow in its neck. As it thrust its head forward, sniffing at the blood, the man, without a sound, crept out of concealment and made his way round it in a half-circle, stopping behind each tree to observe whether it had moved. He turned his head away to breathe, and carefully placed each footstep clear of twigs and loose pebbles. He was already half a bowshot away from the leopard when suddenly a wild pig trotted out of the scrub, blundered against him, and ran squealing back into the shadows. The leopard turned, gazed intently, and began to pace towards him. He turned and walked steadily away, fighting against the panic impulse to go faster. Looking round, he saw that the leopard had broken into a padding trot and was overtaking him. At this he began to run, flinging down his birds and making towards the ridge in the hope of losing his terrible pursuer in the undergrowth on the lower slopes. At the foot of the ridge, on the edge of a grove of quain, he turned and raised his bow. Although he knew well what was likely to come of wounding the leopard, it seemed to him now that his only desperate chance was to try, among the bushes and creepers, to evade it long enough to succeed in shooting it several times and thus either disable it or drive it away. He aimed and loosed, but his hand was unsteady with fear. The arrow grazed the leopard's flank, hung there for a moment, and fell out. The leopard bared its teeth and charged, snarling, and the hunter fled blindly along the hillside. A stone turned beneath his foot, and he pitched downwards, rolling over and over. He felt a sharp pain as a branch pierced his left shoulder, and then the breath was knocked out of him. His body struck heavily against some great shaggy mass, and he lay on the ground, gasping and witless with terror, looking back in the direction from which he had fallen. His bow was gone, and as he struggled to his knees, he saw that his left arm and hand were red with blood. The leopard appeared at the top of the steep bank from which he had fallen. He tried to keep silent, but a gasp came from his spent lungs, and quick as a bird, its head turned towards him. Ears flat, tail lashing, it crouched above him, preparing to spring. He could see its eye-teeth curving downward, and for long moments hung over his death as though over some frightful drop, at the foot of which his life would be broken to nothing. Suddenly he found himself pushed to one side, and found that he was lying on his back, looking upwards. Standing over him like a cypress tree, one haunch so close to his face that he could smell the shaggy pelt, was a creature so enormous that in his distracted state of mind he could not comprehend it. As a man carried unconscious from a battlefield might wake bemused, and, glimpsing first a heap of refuse, then a cooking fire, then 2 women carrying bundles, might tell that he was in a village, so the hunter saw a clawed foot, bigger than his own head, a wall of coarse hair, burned and half stripped to the raw flesh, as it seemed, a great wedge-shaped muzzle outlined against the sky, and knew that he must be in the presence of an animal. The leopard was still at the top of the bank, cringing now, looking upwards into a face that must be glaring terribly down upon it. Then the giant animal, with a single blow, struck it bodily from the bank, so that it was borne altogether clear, turning over in the air and crashing down among the quain. With a growling roar that set up a cloud of birds, the animal turned to attack again. It dropped on all fours, and as it did so its left side scraped against a tree. At this it snarled and shrank away, wincing with pain. Then, hearing the leopard struggling in the undergrowth, it made towards the sound and was gone. The hunter rose slowly to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. However terrible the transport of fear, the return can be swift, just as one may awaken instantly from deep sleep. He found his bow and crept up the bank. Though he knew what he had seen, yet his mind still whirled incredulously round the centre of certainty, like a boat in a maelstrom. He had seen a bear. But in God's name, what kind of bear? Whence had it come? Had it, in truth, been already on the island when he had come wading through the shallows that morning, or had it sprung into existence out of his own terror in answer to prayer? Had he himself, perhaps, as he crouched almost senseless at the foot of the bank, made some desperate phantom journey to summon it from the world beyond? Whether or not, one thing was sure. Whencesoever it had come, this beast, that had knocked a full-grown leopard flying through the air, was now of this world, was flesh and blood. It would no more vanish than the sparrow on the branch. He limped slowly back towards the river. The goose was gone, and his arrow with it, but the Catlana was still lying where it had fallen, and he pulled out the arrow, heaved it under his good arm, and made for the reeds. It was here that the delayed shock overtook him. He sank down, trembling and silently weeping by the water's edge. For a long time he lay prone, oblivious of his own safety. And slowly there came to him, not all at once, but brightening and burning up little by little like a new-lit fire, the realization of what, of who, it must truly be that he had seen. As a traveller in some far wilderness might by chance pick up a handful of stones from the ground, examine them idly, and then, with mounting excitement, first surmise, next think it probable, and finally feel certain that they must be diamonds, or, as the sea captain, voyaging in distant waters, might round an unknown cape, busy himself for an hour with the handling of the ship, and only then, and gradually, realize that he himself, must have sailed into none other than that undiscovered, fabled ocean known to his forebears by nothing but legend and rumor. So now, little by little, there stole upon this hunter the stupefying, all but incredible knowledge of what it must be that he had seen. He became calm then, got up, and fell to pacing back and forth among the trees by the shore. At last he stood still, faced the sun across the strait, and, raising his unwounded arm, prayed for a long time, a wordless prayer of silence and trembling awe. Then, still dazed, he once more took up the Catlana and waded through the reeds. Making his way back along the shallows, he found a raft which he had moored that morning, loosed it, and drifted away downstream.